We start in the name of God, the most beneficent, the most merciful. All praise is due to God, the Lord of the world, and may peace and blessings of God be upon his Prophet Muhammad, his family, and companions. Students, faculty, friends, and colleagues, I greet you all with Islamic greeting of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today is the fourth event in a series of events sponsored by the Muslim Student Union at UC Irvine. The Muslim Student Union is a religious student organization which aims to provide a comfortable space where students develop into confident, spiritual, moral, and high-achieving leaders who in turn are a positive influence and an example for their surrounding communities. This week, titled Palestine Liberation Week, Getting to the Roots of the Occupation, aims to educate and raise awareness on campus about the plight of the Palestinian people who have been living under illegal occupation for almost 64 years, with the hope that this knowledge will turn into action. Our annual week has often been misconstrued as to be one that harbors anti-Semitism. The MSU has clarified numerous times and will continue to clarify that hatred of any particular group on the basis of their race, color, ethnicity, or religion, including people of the Jewish faith, is not and will not be tolerated. We will be the first to speak out against these injustices, just as we would speak up against any other form of racism, no matter what group it targets. Although this goes without saying, the MSU strives to explicitly state its beliefs nonetheless. It is absolutely hypocritical and immoral to label anyone who has the courage to stand up and speak out against the apartheid policies of Israel as anti-Semitic. This week's aim, in short, is simply to call for an end to the oppression of the indigenous Palestinians. Just as it would make sense to call for an end to the oppression that took place in Nazi Germany or apartheid South Africa, it is absolutely imperative that we call for an end to 64 years of systematic subjugation and repression of the Palestinian people. We will be having a Q&A session after the talk. Please hold all your questions until the end, and please do not disrupt the speaker. Also, for any of you that are with the press, we have a press box in the back over there, and you are free to utilize it. Co-sponsors for this week include Students for Justice in Palestine, Afghanistan Development Project, Alianza Nimada Kabayan, Asian Pacific Student Association, Central American Student Association, Dreams at UCI, Kabayan, Radical Student Union, and Society of Arab Students. Before we start today's event, we will begin with some verses from the Muslim Holy Book, the Quran.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين لله شهداء بالقسط ولا يجرمنكم شنآن قوم على ألا تعدلوا اعدلوا هو أقرب للتقوى واتقوا الله إن الله خبير بما تعملون. O you who have believed, be persistently standing firm for Allah, witnesses in justice, and do not let the hatred of a people prevent you from being just. Be just. That is nearer to righteousness, and fear Allah. Indeed, Allah is acquainted with what you do. Allah.
Thank you for the recitation. Okay. Omar Shakir is currently pursuing his JD at Stanford University School of Law. He completed his master's degree in Arab Studies from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, where he held the prestigious Khalid Jafali Scholarship, and his BA from Stanford with honors in international relations. A 2007-2008 Fulbright scholar in Syria, his academic work has focused on contemporary politics and human rights in the Arab world. Omar has also studied at Oxford and in Morocco, Syria, and Cairo, and spearheaded humanitarian projects in Jordan, Syria, and the West Bank. He spent last summer as a legal intern for the Office of the Prosecutor at the Special Tribunal for Lebanon in The Hague, last quarter in the International Human Rights and Conflict Resolution Clinic at Stanford Law School, and will be working this summer for the ACLU in New York, focusing on post-9/11 civil liberties and human rights litigation. At Stanford, he has been actively involved in student organizations related to law in the Middle East. He currently serves as president of the International Law Society, co-president of the Iraqi Refugee Assistance Program, co-chair of the campus chapter of the co-chair of the campus chapter of the National Lawyers Guild, founding vice president of the Stanford Association for Law in the Middle East, and co-president of Students for Palestinian Equal Rights, a group he founded at Stanford as an undergraduate in 2006. As an undergrad, he was elected to the undergraduate senate with the most votes in the association's history, served as a student representative to the Board of Trustees Finance Committee, and was president of the Muslim Students Awareness Network in the year it was named Organization of the Year by the ASSU. In recognition for his contributions, Omar received Stanford's James W. Lyons Service Award. Please welcome Omar Shakir.
Thank you all very much for coming. It's really an honor to be speaking at UC Irvine. I spoke here 2 years ago, just after the Michael Oren action, and what I said then was it was an honor to speak at a campus that said that there's no place here for war criminals. But I come today even more in awe of the courage of you all here at UC Irvine, because you really rallied together around the case of the Irvine 11. And really stood up to these politicized prosecutors who, instead of prosecuting Michael Oren and his like for crimes against humanity that were committed in the Gaza Strip, instead of doing that, they've used ways to use criminal law to go after students for exercising their right to free speech. And not only did you rally around this group, but you guys continue to be active, and I've really been very impressed to hear about this week's activities and all the other organizing that you continue to do here, even in the face of such overwhelming pressure. So it's really an honor to be here. And I know you guys have heard, you heard from Ben White yesterday, many of you, and some of you heard me speak here 2 years ago. So I hope I won't be repetitive, but really my goal in this presentation is to describe why the current reality in Israel and Palestine constitutes apartheid and what we can do about it. So as not to overlap with some of the other presentations you've heard, I'll try to focus more on kind of legal notions of what apartheid means and try to look at other parallels that really haven't, I think, been discussed enough when this parallel has been made. So I think as a first point, it's really important to note that calling the situation apartheid should make you uncomfortable. After all, Nelson Mandela in his autobiography wrote, quote, "With the exception of Hitler's genocide against the Jews, there is no evil that has been so condemned by the entire world as apartheid." The idea that a regime today, in 2012, is an apartheid regime should be an idea that's very difficult for us all to swallow, and we shouldn't take it lightly. I know it's been particularly difficult for many in the Jewish community to come to terms with this idea, because many in that community, including Zionists, played a leading role in the struggle against apartheid South Africa. My goal in this presentation is not to say that the situation in Israel and Palestine today is an exact carbon copy replica of what took place in South Africa. Instead, I hope to discuss how the current situation meets the internationally legally recognized definition of the crime of apartheid, and to draw parallels between some fundamental similarities, because I think it's incumbent upon all of us, especially here at campus, to really understand and learn from history so we can go forward with a better understanding of it. So of course, while the term apartheid was developed to refer to the situation in South Africa, it was given an international definition in two prominent legal instruments. So let me just briefly give you that definition, and I hope to spend most of my time going through how the current reality fits these definitions. The first is the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, which was brought into force in 1973 by UN General Assembly Resolution 3068. Here's how it defined apartheid. Pay attention to this part. Quote, "Inhumane acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them." The Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court, which came into force in 2002, also defined the crime of apartheid in the following ways. Inhumane acts of a character similar to those referred to in paragraph 1. Paragraph 1 defines crimes against humanity, committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. Of course, subsequent legal instruments have extended the definition beyond racial groups to ethnic and religious categories. But the key factors that emerge from this definition are a few. 1, maintaining domination by one group. 2, institutional, systematic discrimination and oppression. And the third is a regime that's really intent on maintaining that system. So the structure of my presentation will be to go through how the reality in Israel and Palestine meets this definition. So first I'll talk a little bit about the legal status and political rights, and how it's fundamentally defined by your ethnicity or your race. Secondly, I want to look at everyday life, especially in the occupied territories, and talk about how this fundamentally reflects a regime intent on maintaining domination by one group. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the logic and justification for apartheid, which really gets to the purpose of this regime that this definition captures. And I'll end the presentation by talking a little bit about important differences and why they may or may not be relevant, and finally end with one lesson, one for Israelis, one for Palestinians, and one for each of us here in the international community. So to start in the first area, different legal status and political rights. I think it's familiar to anybody in this room that studied Israel, that studied South Africa, even at a superficial level, that fundamentally your legal standing in that regime was defined by your race or ethnicity. South Africans couldn't vote and, for example, weren't protected by the law in South Africa. But that's really the reality of what's happening in Israel and Palestine. But the genius of the Israeli system is that they've given different sets of rights to Palestinians, depending on whether they're in the occupied territories, whether they're in Palestinian citizens of Israel, whether they're refugees. So let me briefly go through and break down how this regime operates. Let's start fundamentally in the occupied territories, where the reality is you have Israeli settlers, and for those that aren't familiar, settlers refers to Israeli communities in the occupied territories that have developed since 1967 in contravention of the Fourth Geneva Convention, and you have Palestinians that live in the same land. According to an article in Nation magazine, there's, quote, a dual system at work here, one for Jews and one for Palestinians. So what's this difference mean? So people who live in the same land are subject to a completely different legal system. So Israeli settlers, for example, hold Israeli citizenship, are protected by Israeli laws, vote in elections, and can travel freely throughout the territories. But every single one of these rights is denied by Palestinians who don't vote in Israeli elections, who aren't able to travel freely, who aren't protected by any legal system, and who don't hold citizenship. So many people will hear this fact and say, well, Omar, there's a clear reason why this is the case. It's because the West Bank isn't part of Israel. These same people will say, look at the Palestinian Authority. That really is the governing body for Palestinians. However, much like the black homelands of apartheid South Africa, the Palestinian Authority lacks real sovereignty. It has no control of its borders, its airspace, it has no ability to, of its water resources, it has no military, and really no ability to tax its own population. Fundamentally, all people, Jewish and non-Jewish, between the river, Jordan, and the sea are controlled fundamentally in the hands of Tel Aviv. And again, it was much like the black homelands of South Africa, where really the purpose was to save the cost of occupation. It's much easier, instead of having the IDF itself having to physically control everyday life in the territories, to have a face that would be there to actually administer everyday issues and to give the impression of independence and authority. In fact, F.W. de Klerk, who was the last prime minister of apartheid South Africa, had this to say about the situation in Israel and Palestine. Quote, as a young parliamentarian, I was enthusiastic about forming independence homelands for every group, including the Afrikaner. The roadmap between Israel and Palestine is based on exactly the same principles. What apartheid originally wanted to achieve is what everyone now says is the solution for Israel and Palestine. In 2003, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz reported that the former Italian Prime Minister, Massimo D'Alema, as telling dinner guests at a Jerusalem hotel that on a visit to Rome a few years earlier, Ariel Sharon, who was the Prime Minister, had told them that the Bantustan model was the most appropriate solution to the conflict with the Palestinians. Now many people will say, look at Gaza, Israeli settlers left, but still there's problems. But the reason why Israeli settlers left Gaza is really to minimize the problem and to maximize control. Israel still effectively occupies the Gaza Strip, and apparently has shut down the lights in this building too. So that's one point. People will say, well, there's a reason for a different legal regime. It's because of the Palestinian Authority. The second argument people will make is, well, settlements are temporary, right? You can't fundamentally characterize a regime by some temporary institutions. And you'll find many articles, even written by Israeli politicians and by Americans, that will say we're on the precipice or on the brink of apartheid, but we're not yet at apartheid. What people fail to realize is that settlements have existed for more than 2/3 the life of the Israeli state. There are over 500,000 settlers now in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. And as I saw myself, I visited a settlement in 2005, I can tell you, they're built as permanent structures. They aren't there as temporary things that are one day going to be removed. They very much, especially with the wall, were built to remain. So that's the situation in a very nutshell in occupied territories. What about East Jerusalem? In some ways, East Jerusalem is fundamentally worse because Israel illegally annexed East Jerusalem. However, Palestinians have been denied citizenship and are considered to be legal temporary residents. In many cases, in the land that their family has lived in for generations. And of course, they're subject to a whole regime of home demolitions, of being separated from families, of housing densities, of education levels that are not the same at all as the Jewish residents of Jerusalem. How about the situation within Israel? Can you still make this argument? And I would argue that it's harder to make, but yes, the situation there is apartheid. Israel's basic law of human dignity, which is one of the documents that form the Israeli constitution, defines Israel as a Jewish state instead of a state of its citizens. And it systematically discriminates against non-Jews, as has even been documented by the U.S. Department of State in their annual report on Israeli human rights. Israeli Arabs, or the term of art used to refer to Palestinians who did not flee in 1948 and who constitute 20% of the population, are the biggest victims. Now, I know Ben White talked a lot about this yesterday, so I won't go too much into details, but just a few examples of the discriminatory policies in Israel proper. One is land policies. 91% of the land in Israel, according to a New York Times article, and actually it was written, I think, in 1999, so the stat may be a little bit more now, explicitly cannot be sold to non-Jews. And a subset of this land cannot even be rented. That's the segment that's administered by the Jewish National Fund. When we look at the school system, we realize that Jewish Israelis and Palestinians attend different school systems, which do not receive nearly the same resources. So you'll find, for example, that education levels for Palestinians in the West Bank are actually higher than Palestinians within Israel. That's the kind of disparity in education you see that takes place in Israel. And the racial basis actually isn't written into law. It's a de facto practice that occurs, and it occurs with resource allocation. And it's the same situation in South Africa. And much like South Africa, where the textbooks that were used in the black schools were used to rewrite the history of South Africa, the same thing happens with the textbooks that are used and are taught to Palestinians. Moreover, and Human Rights Watch and others have documented how the resource disparity is stark among schools. How about other areas? We move to the fact that there are 40 villages in Israel that are unrecognized by the Israeli state. That means there are 40 villages, in some cases located kilometers away from major Israeli cities, that don't receive sewage or water, or electricity, or the most basic services. And these villages are predominantly Palestinian. But this policy even extends to social policies. And as I think Ben mentioned yesterday, Israeli marriage laws allow Israelis to marry anybody in the world. And that spouse is automatically granted citizenship except Palestinians. If an Israeli is to marry a Palestinian, that Palestinian cannot gain citizenship in Israel. The final category, though, we talked about Palestinians in East Jerusalem, in the occupied territories, in Israel. The final category is refugees. And even with refugees, I would argue that apartheid is the term of art to use. Because at a fundamental level, Israel's law of return grants automatic citizenship to Jews from anywhere in the world upon request. And Israel spends millions of dollars going around the world recruiting Jews to move to Israel, but denies the same right to Palestinian refugees and refuses to allow them to return to their homes. So let's take an example. Tomorrow, a Jewish American who has never been to Israel can move to Israel and automatically become a citizenship. Whereas a Palestinian refugee who has been languishing in a refugee camp for over 6 decades with keys to their home and having lived in the historic land of Palestine for hundreds of years is denied that right solely on the basis of their ethnic or racial group. If this doesn't meet the international definition of the crime of apartheid, I frankly don't know what does. Palestinians today constitute 1/3 of the world's refugees, nearly 5 million registered with UNRWA, and many UN resolutions, you saw in the video 101, that's higher than the number I had, but let's go with 101, have reaffirmed their fundamental rights, including their right to return. So that's part one. Different legal and political system for Israelis, for Jews and non-Jews in the land between the river and the sea. Secondly, let's talk about everyday life and transport, which I think represents the greatest challenge for life today in Israel and Palestine. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the Nobel Peace Laureate from South Africa and former Archbishop of Cape Town, had this to say when he visited the West Bank. There are 3 different articles he wrote, and I'm going to quote excerpts from each 3. The first one, quote, "History, it seems, repeated itself. Apartheid is back, complete with a separation wall and Bantustans." His second article, he writes, "If I were to change the names, a description of what is happening in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank could describe events in South Africa." And his third article, "Yesterday's South African township dwellers can tell you about today's life in the occupied territory. To travel only blocks in his own homeland, a grandfather waits on the whim of a teenage soldier. More than an emergency is needed to get to a hospital, less than a crime earns a trip to jail. The lucky ones have a permit to leave their squalor to work in Israeli cities." That, by the way, has changed. But their luck runs out when security closes all checkpoints, paralyzing the entire people. The indignities, dependencies, and anger are all too familiar. So what is this regime that Desmond Tutu is talking about? Let's break it down a little bit. What do Palestinians in the occupied territories face every day? Well, for one thing, there are nearly 700 closure obstacles in the territory. Now, these closure obstacles, most of which are checkpoints, are actually not located on the Green Line, or the internationally recognized border between the occupied territories and Israel. For the most part, they're located between Palestinian towns and villages. At these checkpoints, Palestinians are routinely delayed and humiliated by teenage soldiers, making a daily commute, which in some cases should only be a few minutes, become hour-long ordeals. Transportation is further limited by a color ID system. So, for example, Palestinians in the West Bank have green IDs. So you could be living in Bethlehem, which is located 9 kilometers from Jerusalem, but you're not allowed to go to Jerusalem if you hold a green ID, right? Whereas if you have blue ID, you're allowed to go to some places and not to others. Those are the ones from Jerusalem. On top of that, permits are often required for transport from one city to another. So, for example, when I was in the West Bank, I was going from Jenin to Ramallah one day, and my cab driver couldn't take me all the way because he didn't have a permit to travel outside the limits of Jenin. But the biggest impediment, and I mean this both figuratively and literally, is the separation barrier, which Israel built in 2002. Now, of course, Israel claims that it built the separation barrier, like it claims for the checkpoints, for security purposes. However, the separation barrier isn't located again on the Green Line. In fact, it annexes significant chunks of the West Bank, about 15%, and it will be larger if the Jordan Valley, that side of it, is built to Israel. To give you perspective, the border, or the Green Line, is about 200 kilometers long. The barrier, 790. To put this in context, the separation barrier is over twice the height at certain lengths, and 4 times the length of the Berlin Wall. The International Court of Justice, in an advisory opinion in 2004, ruled that the structure, in a unanimous opinion where only the United States abstained, ruled the structure illegal and called for it to be immediately dismantled. And you can imagine the effect a structure like this, built in one's own territory, can have on everyday life. And there are both direct and indirect effects. The direct effects are the nearly 50,000 Palestinians who have been separated. Their homes have been separated from the rest of the West Bank, which in many cases divides families from their farms, or families from schools or hospitals. And 10.1% of the most fertile land is part of this part that Israel has annexed. Of course, also includes Palestinians of East Jerusalem. the nearly 250,000 of them that have been separated from, in many cases, family, friends, communities, life in the West Bank. But there are also the indirect effects. So we can talk about the economic effects. You can imagine the difficulties of trade and of foreign investment when you have a structure like this that impedes everyday transport. So for example, you've seen a lot of foreign investment go down and businesses destroyed, or education. Thousands have dropped out of school systems because they're no longer able to reach their schools. So for example, the Palestine University of Beirut was closed for 5 years, from 1987 to 1992, because after the first Intifada, Israel really limited a lot of Palestinian mobility. Or health. According to a health NGO in Palestine, 92 Palestinians have died in ambulances because they were unable to reach a hospital held up at checkpoints. But of course, probably the best way to describe the effects of this different transport system is to talk about one Palestinian village. The village of Palestine, which is literally encircled by the wall. I wish I had a picture I could show you, but the wall literally encircles the city. And at its worst point in 2005, there was only a single exit from which Palestinians could leave or enter, which was open 3 times a day for 15 minutes. I visited this city both in 2005 and in 2010, and it's become a ghost town with nearly 70% unemployment. And although it was dominated by Fatah for many years, in the most recent elections, Hamas won control of the city. And the reason why Israel built the wall the way it did around this town is because some of the most strategic water resources are located along this land. And much of the water that Israel uses, both in settlements in Israel, is located in these parts of the West Bank. So this is what Palestinians face. Now what about Israelis that live in the very same land? How do they move from place to place? Well, Israel has constructed a system of bypass roads for settlers and soldiers. These roads are explicitly Israeli only. Palestinians are not allowed on them. So while Palestinians wind around walls and checkpoints and permits and stuff, Israelis, like the foreign minister Avigdor Lieberman, can go every day and commute between his settlement and parliament and the Knesset, sorry. So that's the fundamental reality. Your fundamental everyday transport is changed based on what your race or nationality is. But of course, other aspects of everyday life are affected. For example, Israel controls 80% of the water resources in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So on average, an Israeli settler uses 6 times the water resources of a Palestinian. So for example, if you go to the territories, you might sometimes not have running water or hot water, but you'll see settlements located kilometers away in which there are swimming pools and they're watering their lawns with this water. So in addition to these everyday transportation water things, of course the occupation includes an unfortunate military component. And I don't think I need to tell this audience about Operation Cast Lead, or about what happened in Lebanon, or about the flotilla, or about what living under military occupation means. But I want to quote one person I think can put this in perspective. And that is a person named Ronnie Kasrlis. Ronnie Kasrlis was a Jewish member of the African National Congress, a prominent advocate against apartheid South Africa. He actually became the intelligence minister for the post-apartheid South African government under Nelson Mandela. He's Jewish and he visited the West Bank, and here's what he had to say. This is a direct quote. "This is much worse than apartheid. The Israeli measures, the brutality, make apartheid look like a picnic. We never had jets attacking our townships. We never had sieges that lasted month after month. We never had tanks destroying houses. We had armored vehicles and police using small arms to shoot people, but not on this scale." Just to give you perspective on this quote, I participated 2 weeks ago in a debate on this topic at UC Berkeley. And I was debating a visiting professor from Israel, and I quoted this quote. And the professor interjected to say, yeah, it's true, it's not apartheid, but it is worse than apartheid. But what she really meant to say, it's not apartheid, but she agreed with this quote. So it's I think it's very important to realize that even the most ardent supporters of Israel will acknowledge that the level of military involvement and the kind of crimes we've seen take place against Palestinians are really unprecedented. So Ronnie Kasrlis, who I quoted here, actually signed a declaration of conscience along with 200 other Jewish anti-apartheid activists from South Africa. Let me just read you a quote from this letter they wrote back in 2001. Quote, "It becomes difficult, particularly from a South African perspective, not to draw parallels with the oppression experienced by Palestinians under the hand of Israel and the oppression experienced in South Africa under apartheid rule. That was in the Washington Post on December 19, 2001. I encourage you to all look it up. So what does living under military occupation mean for Palestinians? Again, a few just data points so we can get to the rest of the presentation. 40% of the adult male population of Palestinians have been detained since 1967. That should be pretty startling. 2 out of every 5. In addition to this startling statistic, there are nearly 9,000 Palestinians currently in detention, 2,200 of which who have never been charged, and over 800 that are defined by the United Nations and Amnesty International as children. Back in March, Defense of Children, an NGO based in the United Kingdom, released a report, and this is a quote from their report. They documented 7,500 children that have been detained in the last 11 years. Here's a quote about how these children are detained. Quote, "There is a systematic pattern of ill treatment and in some cases torture of children held in military detention system, with the majority of the abuse occurring during the first 48 hours. 75% of these children were actually had physical violence used against them while in detention." So of course, the Human Rights Watch, the UN Committee Against Torture, has faulted Israel for its use of torture. Of course, Israel also engaged in extrajudicial killings. In fact, the US drone policy, now in place in Yemen, Somalia, and Pakistan, was modeled on Israel's targeted assassination program. Israel often enacts curfews where entire areas, cities and villages aren't allowed to leave their homes for periods at a time based on security needs. And of course, there are home demolitions. And these home demolitions often tear down entire complexes with little or no warning, or with no evidence used against them. So while there sometimes are legitimate purposes, for the most part it constitutes collective punishment. So now that we finished part 2 of the presentation, we talked a little bit about everyday life. I want to talk a little bit, and I think in some ways this is the most underspoken about area of the comparison between South Africa and Israel, is about the logic of apartheid, or the justification for apartheid. Remember, the definition I quoted in the beginning talked about purpose. There's a quote from the Rome Statute definition saying, "They're committed with the intention of maintaining that regime." So how is the logic for apartheid in South Africa and Israel similar or different? I argue that both conflicts are underlined by narratives of expulsion, persecution, redemption, and rebirth that characterize the mentality of the stronger power and create a single-minded quest for national survival. In the case of Israel, the story is very clear. The Holocaust and Jewish persecution in Europe, and the inability of Jews to live as a minority in a need for a state of their own, and for their rebirth in the land of Palestine. But many don't understand the history of South Africa. So if you'll indulge me to go a little bit into this history of the Afrikaner, or the white South African population, I think it will be instructive. So Afrikaners, or Boers, or the minority group that ruled South Africa until 1994, had a similar ideology of victimhood, in many ways very similar. They traced their identity back to April 6, 1652, when the Dutch East Indian Company established a colony on the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. Nelson Mandela, in his autobiography, talks about what this date meant. Quote, "The day white South Africans annually commemorate the founding of their country, and Africans revile as the beginning of 300 years of enslavement." So the Boer population, the Afrikaner, remained on the Cape until the mid-19th century, when it began to migrate towards the heart of South Africa. But during this period, the Boers struggled under British colonialism. In fact, the British initiated a scorched earth policy and actually set up concentration camps. In fact, the term concentration camp was first used to describe the way the British treated the Afrikaner population. During these concentration camps, tens of thousands were killed, and many were imprisoned. In fact, 28,000 of the over 100,000 prisoners that were in these concentration camps were killed, including 94% women and children. This event had a huge effect on the Boer population, almost like the Holocaust did to the Jewish community. F.W. de Klerk, who I quoted earlier, the last Prime Minister of Apartheid South Africa, wrote this: "The Anglo-Boer War burnt itself into the collective consciousness of my people, the Afrikaners, like no other event in history." This event made them determined never again to submit to foreign rule and independence. So in 1910, the white South African community set up the Union of South Africa, which excluded the native population. And in 1948, Yes, 1948. The nationalists in South Africa came to power on a platform of erecting an apartheid system. And the mentality of victimhood, the need to define themselves and not to be swallowed by the people around them, was the reason why they voted apartheid into place. Here's a quote from the 1948 Nationalist Party platform. Quote, "The choice between us is of two divergent courses, either that of integration, which would in the long run amount to national suicide on the part of whites, or that of apartheid, which professes to preserve the identity and safeguard the future of every race." Don Krause, who is the chairman of the Johannesburg Holocaust Survivors Association, wrote, "What the nationalists were trying to do was protect the Afrikaner, especially after what was done to them in the Boer War, where the Afrikaner was reduced to almost a beggar on returning after that war, whether it was from the battlefield or a concentration camp. They did it being apartheid, to protect the Afrikaner, his predominance after 1948, his culture." The Afrikaner also used religion. Religious justifications aren't unique to Israel. Nelson Mandela talked about this. He wrote, quote, "Like the Israeli journey to the promised land, his being the Afrikaner or the Boer, was the fulfillment of God's promise and the justification for their view that South Africa should be a white man's country forever." In fact, the Afrikaner themselves compared their journey to the Israeli exodus from Egypt and saw their republic as a new Israel. The Dutch Reformed Church, which was the major church in South Africa, found justifications for apartheid out of the Old Testament and Afrikaner history, seizing on the battles of the Zulus of Blood River as confirming that the Almighty sided with the white man. Ronnie Cashless, again, who I quoted earlier, had this to say, quote, "Israelis claim that they are the chosen people, the elect of God, and find biblical justification for their racism and Zionist exclusivity. This is just like the Afrikaners of apartheid South Africa, who also had the biblical notion that the land was their God-given right. Like the Zionists who claimed that Palestine in the 1940s was a land without people for a people without land, so too the Afrikaner settlers spread the myth that there were no black people in South Africa when they first settled in the 17th century. They conquered by force of arms and terror and the provocation of a series of bloody colonial wars of conquest." But even more significantly is the relationship of both the Boer population to the blacks of South Africa and Israelis and Palestinians. They both saw themselves as the indigenous people. They both saw themselves as outposts against uncivilized people. They both saw themselves as being in tough neighborhoods. 5 million Israelis in a sea of Arabs and Muslims, just as there were literally 5 million whites in a sea of blacks. In fact, the Guardian newspaper reports in 1976 the South African apartheid regime put out a yearbook. I don't know why a government puts out a yearbook, but they put out a yearbook. And this is a direct quote from the yearbook. "Israel and South Africa have one thing above all else in common. Quote, they are both situated in a predominantly hostile world inhabited by dark people. Both the Boers and Israelis used colonial logic and racism. The people they were fighting with were inferior, so their resistance was naturally irrational. It was naturally terrorism, whereas theirs was self-defense and theirs was civilization. But they also had a fundamental contradiction. Apartheid South Africa talked about being a parliamentary democracy and having progressive values and having technology. But the only way they can put up that myth is to hide their interactions with the native population. In fact, they reversed the colonial relationship. South Africa and Israel both depict their history as struggles as fights for independence against colonial powers, whether it be the Boer War or the 1947-48 Israeli War of Independence between quotes. So what did they do to propagate this myth? They gave the native population a choice. Your choice, submit or disappear. And they did everything possible to erase any memory of the indigenous population. Nelson Mandela wrote this in 1955 when he was in South Africa, when he was driving through the streets of South Africa. Quote, "From Durban, I drove along the coast past Port Shepstone and Port St. John's, small and lovely colonial towns that dotted the shimmering beaches fronting the Indian Ocean. While mesmerized by the beauty of the area, I was constantly rebuffed by the buildings and streets that bear the names of white imperialists who suppress the very people whose names belong there. Remember that quote. Now let me tell you a quote of Moshe Dayan, the Israeli defense minister in 1969. He was reviewing Israel's achievements 20 years later. He said, quote, "Jewish villages were built in the place of Arab villages. You don't even know the names of these Arab villages, and I don't blame you, because the geography books no longer exist. Not only do the books not exist, the Arab villages are not there either. There is not a single place built in the country that did not have a former Arab population." It's striking the extent to which they had to do the same fundamental thing. More fundamentally, both South Africa and Israel were obsessed with demographics. Right? Israeli policy in the last decade, if you want to understand anything Israel does, the first question you should always ask yourself is, is it being done to maintain a Jewish majority against the Palestinian demographic time bomb? And the answer will be likely yes. In fact, Israeli President Shimon Peres, former prime minister, wrote that they even withdrew from Gaza because of demography, right? Because if they had 105 million Palestinians in Gaza, being part of how they define the Israeli state, then automatically you're going to have a majority Palestinian population. Let's look at this in comparative perspective. Imagine Texas undertook policies to maintain a white majority in the face of a growing minority population. We would call that racism. So why is it suddenly okay for us to listen to Israeli politicians who say we want to maintain a Jewish majority? Right? It's fundamentally counterintuitive. F.W. de Klerk, again, last Prime Minister of Apartheid South Africa, said this about South Africa. "Foremost among these was our conviction that without apartheid, our people would be swamped by the vast black majority, and that this would inevitably lead to the extinction of our hard-fought-won right to self-determination." This is so similar to the arguments that Israelis make when they talk about the cancerous growth of Palestinians. The similarities of South Africa and Israel certainly were not lost on South African or Israeli officials. And the proof in some ways in the pudding is in the kind of relationship that South Africa and Israel had. Now, just because two countries had strong ties, which Israel and South Africa did, doesn't mean that they had an ideological congruence. But I want to read a few quotes to tell you about how South Africans and Israelis viewed the tie they had to one another. Of course, I should say that Israel didn't always have a strong tie to South Africa. In the 1950s and 1960s, Israel fought very hard to win relationships with newly independent African states. But after 1973, when the majority of post-colonial African states basically cut ties with Israel, Israel grew very close to South Africa. In 1976, Israel invited South African apartheid Prime Minister John Volster, who, by the way, was a former Nazi sympathizer, for a state visit. During the dinner in Israel, Rabin toasted that, quote, "the ideals shared by Israel and South Africa," he talked about the ideals shared between Israel and South Africa, and discussed how both countries face, quote, "foreign-inspired instability and recklessness." The relationship continued to grow. So the Israeli foreign ministry had a South Africa desk, which was headed by a guy named Alon Liao. And he wrote, quote, "We created the South African arms industry. They assisted us to develop all kinds of technology because they had a lot of money. When we were developing things together, we gave them the know-how and they gave the money. After 1976, there was a love affair between the security establishments of the two countries and their armies. We were involved in Angola as consultants to the South African army. You had Israeli officers there cooperating with the army. The link was intimate." Ariel Sharon in the early 1980s was one of the Israeli officers that conducted these military maneuvers with the South African army. And this is what he had to say. "When I look at South African officers, I imagine soon they will give orders in Hebrew. Their physical appearance, openness, and battlefield behavior all remind me of IDF officers." When people started boycotting South Africa, the key for Israel maintaining its aviation and in South Africa developing its nuclear program was the know-how and technology that came from Israel. Now let me make one other point to show you how even South Africans and Jewish and Zionists saw the ties between the two countries. In the early 1990s, the police in San Francisco raided the offices of the JDC in San Francisco. And they found that that organization was keeping files on all apartheid activists from South Africa. The implication is clearly they were afraid that these same people would eventually turn on Israel. The former Deputy Prime Minister Maroon Ben-Benisti recounts this short anecdote to tell you just how similar these parties saw one another. This is a quote from him. Again, the Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem. Quote, "I was invited with a colleague of mine, one of Diane's advisors on the West Bank, to a lunch with a South African official on a visit to Jerusalem. During lunch, we discussed our work, and the official showed great interest in our ideas on how to improve Israeli-Palestinian relations by giving the Palestinians a loan to manage their own affairs. Suddenly, he asked, 'How would you react if we were to invite you to advise the new government in Transky?' The Transky is one of the black homelands. We were shocked. His query implied that he considered our work comparable to the reactionary, racist schemes in the Bantustans. When we expressed our indignation, he smiled and said, 'I understand your reaction, but aren't we doing the same thing? We face the same existential problem. Therefore, we arrive at the same solution.'" Contrast that to Ronnie Castrolis, Desmond Tutu, all the other people who fought against apartheid and the kinds of statements they made, and even Nelson Mandela. Of course, many people know the quote when Mandela said, quote, "We consider ourselves to be comrades in arms to the Palestinian Arabs in their struggle for the liberation of Palestine. There is not a single citizen in South Africa who is not ready to stand by his Palestinian brothers in their legitimate fight against Zionist racists." Can make that contrast. So to conclude, two kind of major things I want to conclude with. So if you give me a little bit of time to do either. First is to note some important differences, because there are some differences between South Africa and Israel. And I'll finally end with a few lessons I talked about. So really quickly, 6 differences. First, the kind of petty apartheid that existed in apartheid South Africa, where you had drinking fountains only for whites but not for blacks, that doesn't exist in Palestine, and that is a legitimate difference. But fundamentally, the institutional systematic discrimination that is part of the definition of apartheid that I gave earlier is the same. Second, many people will say that there are different logics, that Israel's isn't for racist sake, right? They have legitimate purposes. And I kind of dealt with this when I talked about the logics and the similarities. But also, part of this difference, which I'll agree occurs to some degree, is a product of time. It's no longer acceptable in 2012 to openly proclaim to be an apartheid state the way South Africa did in 1948. Israel is a lot smarter about the way it deals with its apartheid system, but it's fundamentally the same thing. John Dugard, who is a South African lawyer and was a UN human rights monitor, had this to say about this point. Quote, "Apartheid was all about land. Apartheid was about keeping the best parts of the country for the whites and sending the blacks to the least habitable, least desirable parts of the country. And one sees that all the time here in the occupied territories, particularly with the wall, which really is a land grab. One sees parallels with respect to South Africa that during the heyday of apartheid, population relocation did result in destruction of property, but not on the same scale as devastation in Gaza in particular, nor in the West Bank." So again, logics often are couched in the language of land, human rights, and resources, and it's meant to really give one side power against the other. The third difference is time frame. People will say, well, South Africa goes back to the mid-17th century, but the Palestinian conflict really started in the mid-20th century. And while this is true, the heart of apartheid in South Africa, as I said in the history, was from 1910 to 1994. That is an 84-year period. Next week, we mark 64 years since the creation of the State of Israel. 20 years, we may see a different reality on the ground. Fourth, people will say, look, the U.S.-Israeli relationship is unique, right? That makes everything different. There is some truth in this. But the fact of the matter is, under the Reagan administration in particular, the U.S. had very strong ties to apartheid South Africa. We valued the gold and diamond industries there, and we had a strong economic tie to apartheid South Africa. More significantly, there is such a strong international consensus in support of justice and human rights for the Palestinians, reflected in all the UN resolutions that have been passed. In much the same way there was a consensus about South Africa. Others will say, look at the civil rights movement. The reason why we had the movement against apartheid South Africa is it came 20 years after the civil rights movement in the US. So many in the US made the connection between civil rights in the US and apartheid in South Africa. Well, even this is changing now with the Arab Spring, right? Because in the US, we had to, the fight in apartheid, South Africa had to deal with racism, right? And in our struggle about Palestine, we often deal with Islamophobia or phobia about Arabs. But in many ways, the Arab Spring and what's happening across the region is fundamentally changing that narrative. The fifth difference, people will say leadership. They'll say no matter what you say about Israel, or about South Africa, the ANC and the PLO aren't the same bodies. And again, there's some truth in that, right? The ANC never accepted Bantustans, whereas the PLO signed the Oslo Accords, right? Nelson Mandela said only free men negotiate, but Palestinians negotiate even as an occupied people, right? But one difference that is not too different is the use of violence, right? People often say, well, suicide bombing, it makes it all different. And in truth, there has been some violence in the Palestinian resistance. But the overwhelming narrative of Palestinian history is a non-violent struggle from the beginning of the 20th century to today. But even more fundamentally, people gloss over the fact that violence was used in South Africa, right? It's easy to have this vision of South African history that ignores that. Nelson Mandela again wrote, quote, "Violence was the only weapon that would destroy apartheid, and we must be prepared in the near future to use that weapon." He went on to write that the powerful power dictates the form of a conflict. And that, and again, this is a direct quote, "We felt that without violence there would be no way to open to the African people to succeed in the struggle against the principles of white supremacy. All lawful modes of expressing opposition to this principle had been closed by legislation, and we were placed in a position to which we had to either accept a permanent state of inferiority or to defy the government." Again, this isn't to condone or support violence, but in many cases, Palestinians have been put in the same boat. When you see Palestinian non-violent leaders who are leading daily demonstrations against the wall being put in prison or being killed in many cases. And there even was a radical version of the ANC, right? There was a Black People's Convention, and their slogan that they used to use in conference was, quote, "Black must rule. We shall drive them to the sea." So even in South Africa, you had radicals, right? So to say that it's fundamentally different is simply disingenuous. The final difference, people will say, is Israel faced a war of survival. It faces unprecedented threats. But again, that might be somewhat true, but Israel has also used unprecedented levels of violence against Palestinians, as I said earlier with the quote from Ronnie Kasrils. So to conclude, one lesson. One for Israelis, one for Palestinians, and one for us as an international community. For the lesson for Israelis, I will turn to the advice that was actually given by South African Foreign Minister Piet Botha, who was the last foreign minister, not prime minister, foreign minister under the apartheid regime. Here's the quote he gave when he was asked for advice to give Israelis. "We can explain how we overcame our own fear of majority rule and began to realize that majority rule was something in our interest in the long term. If the Israelis are interested, we can, in all humility, explain how we came to the point of transforming our society." De Klerk writes that the key realization for him was that the struggle could not be won by brutal, unconventional operations which were in conflict with common decency and basic morality. And again, quote, "There is no evidence that the assassination of opponents had the slightest effect on the final outcome of the struggle, other than causing further personal suffering and bitterness." As de Klerk sat and watched Nelson Mandela take the oath of office in 1994, here's how he described his emotions. "The dream they had dreamt," he's talking about his ancestors, "of being free and separate people with their own right to national self-determination in their own nation state in southern Africa, the ideal to which I myself had clung, until I finally concluded that if pursued would bring disaster to all people of our country, including my own." De Klerk got a Nobel Peace Prize. It's because he reached this realization that to maintain the equivalent of a Zionist exclusive state or an Afrikaner exclusive state would have meant much bloodshed. And at the end of the day, it wouldn't have changed the bottom line. With Kasled, with Lebanon, what we see is that Israel is increasingly resorting to more and more questions. So my question to the Zionists and to the Israelis in the room is, when will the Israeli de Klerk stand up? For Palestinians, the lesson for Palestinians, I think, is clear. They must follow the leadership that's being set by the 2,000 Palestinian prisoners currently on hunger strike. And that is to shift their rhetoric from a rhetoric of nationalism to a rights-based approach. Now, why is this the case? And of course, when I say nationalism, we could talk maybe in Q&A about what nationalism means. But what I'm talking about is the idea of independence from foreign rule, or the idea of unity based on an exclusive religious or ethnic identity. The fact is, Palestinians for many years resorted to nationalism. And of course, Islamism falls under the rubric of nationalism. And the reason they did this is because they wanted to appeal to Arab states. They sought to reclaim all their land as part of the project to develop a single Arab nation. But the current climate is different, right? Your audience is no longer Arabs and Muslims. Your audience is the international community. And if you want to have an impact with the international community, you must speak a universal, inclusive language. Nationalism as a political ideology, self-determination, it focuses on the other, right? You need the other. Whereas when you attack the unjust system, you focus on the system of injustice. So my advice to Palestinian leadership is to wage a struggle in the name of universal values, right? To break the myth of two sides. Now let's take a moment as historians to reflect. There is a reason why Chechnya and Kurdistan and Palestinians for so long have failed to achieve their aspiration. They're speaking a language that no longer resonates in the international community of self-determination. Whereas South Africans spoke a universal language. They said no to apartheid. In Sudan, they said no to genocide. That's a language you can build coalitions around. The language, if we want our own state, simply doesn't work anymore. Mandela himself spoke directly to white South Africans, assuring them, this is a quote from Mandela, "We do not want to drive you in the sea." F.W. de Klerk, the last South African Prime Minister under apartheid, again, acknowledged the importance of such reassurances and allowing Afrikaner leaders to make the decision to end apartheid because it was in the best interest of those people. Right? Ali Abu Netma, a prominent Palestinian scholar, wrote this about Palestinian nationalism. Palestinian nationalism, like the Zionism to which it is a response, is too narrow to accommodate the present reality of two intertwined populations living on a single piece of land. ANC's breakthrough was its ability to transcend narrow nationalism by putting forward a vision that South Africa belonged to all those who lived in it. And reflecting on those lessons, Abu Netma said, the Palestinian message and methods must make clear that the target is not the Israeli people, but an unjust system that denies one people their rights, identity, and dignity, and condemns the other to increasing isolation, fear, and moral corruption. So if Palestinian leaders need any more advice, take the advice of Ehud Olmert, right? Israeli Prime Minister. Here's what he had to say about this issue. More and more Palestinians are uninterested in a negotiated two-state solution because they want to change the essence of the conflict from an Algerian paradigm to a South African one. From a struggle against occupation in their parlance to a struggle for one man, one vote. That is, of course, a much cleaner struggle, a much more popular struggle, and ultimately a much more powerful struggle. In 2007, when Ehud Olmert was leaving power, he echoed a similar message. He said, if the day comes when the two-state solution collapses and we face a South African-style struggle for equal voting rights, then, as soon as that happens, the state of Israel is finished. Right? Of course, again, for those recording, I'm not saying the state of Israel should be finished. When I say that, I mean the unjust system of apartheid that's in place. And what he's clearly telling us is that we need to change our rhetoric. Let's listen to Ehud Olmert. But this is what Palestinians also want. Right? In 2004, Abu Netma in his book quotes a Palestinian farmer who was talking to a PLO legal advisor about what Palestinians wanted. Here's what the man said. Let's take advice from this Palestinian farmer. I don't care anymore about the Palestinian flag. I don't care anymore about the word Palestine. I don't care anymore about the symbols. I just want to have the same rights as those settlers across the street. I want to be able to drive down this road. I want to be able to send my kids to the hospital or go on vacation when I want to go on vacation. And again, I think the hunger strikes, the prisoner strikes, they're speaking a new language that's universal, inclusive, consistent, and we need to follow their lead. So finally, what is the lesson for all of us, right? All of us that are, for the most part, not Israelis and Palestinians. The first thing is, if we're not Israelis and Palestinians, we have no place to talk about a one or two-state solution, right? It's not my job to tell Palestinians and Israelis what kind of solution they should live in. I have no right, being not an Israeli or Palestinian, to dictate a solution. So we as a solidarity movement shouldn't speak vocally on one solution. Instead, we need to fight the structural imbalance that's in place. Right? What we have today in Palestine is a case of oppressor and oppressed, colonizer and colonized. History shows us that colonial regimes do not relinquish power without a popular struggle or without direct international pressure. It is naive to think that persuasion and talking will convince an oppressive system to give up power. The key is boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which is the most nonviolent, moral, effective way to exercise control. Again, it takes something we have direct control over, right? The investments of our churches, our mosques, our universities, and saying we do not want that to go to funding the occupation, right? Many people, I know this campus has an olive tree, branch tree initiative. I forget what it's called exactly. The problem with the OTI, the Olive Tree Initiative, is that it ignores the power dynamic, right? It assumes that the problem is misunderstanding, right? That if we suddenly sat together and sang Kumbaya in the center of campus, that suddenly all would be well. But we don't do what we do because we hate the other side, right? We do it because there's real issues of human rights and land on the ground that must be resolved, right? So our issue is not with the pro-Israel students on campus. Our issue is with the policies of the Israeli government that violate international law and violate human rights. And the answer to that is directly raising pressure through boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and not in some kind of dialogue scheme. So I conclude by saying the following. All this may sound controversial, right? And I certainly don't need to tell an audience at UC Irvine that sometimes the controversial thing is the right thing, because you guys have been leaders in this. But for all those in the audience that are unsure about what to do in this situation, remember that the middle path isn't always the right path, right? I mean, when the United States sat down to write its Constitution, they took the middle path. And because of that, blacks were 3/5 of a person, right? The middle road isn't always the right road. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy." The struggle that lays in front of us is a difficult one. But let me end the way I've spent much of my presentation quoting Nelson Mandela, who had this to say about freedom. "There is no easy walk to freedom anywhere, and many of us will have to pass through the valley of the shadow of death again and again before we reach the mountaintops of desire. With your help, we can help millions of Israelis and Palestinians reach the mountaintops of their desires." Thank you.
Thank you, Omar, for that wonderful talk. We now have time for the question and answer portion. Please keep your questions concise, relevant, and respectful of the speaker and his topic. After you ask your question, please take a seat, and the speaker will only answer after you have sat down.
No questions, really?
I have a question. As far as everything is clear, why the Palestinian Authority is not taking these advices?
I think fundamentally, and I tried to say this a little bit about the Oslo Accords, right? I mean, the whole reason why the Oslo Accords came into force, right? I mean, you had the first Palestinian Intifada in 1987. That was, for the most part, a non-violent grassroots uprising, right? The leadership of Palestinians were not in the West Bank and Gaza. They had been moved from Jordan to Lebanon to Tunisia, right? So you had this group of really, this group that really was worried, right? There was this indigenous Palestinian leadership that was suddenly claiming the mantle of speaking for Palestinians. So the leadership was very worried. So basically, they began down the path of negotiations with Israel. But what the Oslo Accord did, in essence, they accepted the Bantustan model. They accepted the model that the ANC never accepted in South Africa. And those leaders, Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Ala, all these guys benefit from the status quo, right? Because of this, the 20-year peace process, they get a lot of the contracts. The concrete that's used to build the wall was actually built. Part of the concrete comes from a Palestinian company that's run by a Palestinian Authority officer. What's happening in Israel and Palestine in terms of the Palestinian Authority, there have been articles in Israeli newspapers documenting how they've essentially become part and part of the occupation itself, right? They have an interest as much as Israelis in maintaining the status quo. What you have in Palestine is similar to what you have with Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, right? Or what you have with other pro-Western regimes elsewhere in the Arab world, where essentially what they're doing is what's the goal of the Palestinian Authority? Everyone says that the Palestinian Authority's success is defined if they protect Israel's security. When in history have you ever seen the mandate of a nation state being protecting their neighbor? Right? Like, if that is the fundamental mission of your body, you probably aren't a representative body of your people, right? Essentially, the Palestinian Authority is making it easier for Israel to maintain its occupation. So why are they doing the common sense thing? Why are they often being so counterproductive? Why do they always send to do interviews on behalf of Palestinians, these guys who have no idea of what it takes to launch an international solidarity movement? I think in part it's because a lot of them have a stake in maintaining the status quo. They live nice lives, they have nice houses, they travel around the world, they wear suits and ties and go to big international conferences, they get big contracts in the occupation. They aren't the ones feeling the wrath of the everyday occupation, which is what most Palestinians face.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, we'll go ahead and wrap up. You can go ahead.
Can you further explain how and why, like, boycotting, divesting, and sanctioning is beneficial?
Sure. So I think it relates to the point I made earlier, right? So if we diagnose whenever you have a conflict, you have to diagnose the problem, right? So I tried to say in the international community segment, the problem here is not hatred. It's not two warring people for millennium that have been fighting each other, right? It's a modern conflict about land, human rights, and resources. So the major problem you have on the ground is a structural imbalance of power, right? Like, fundamentally, Israelis don't really feel the cost of an everyday occupation. Many live in Tel Aviv, they live good lives, they have good jobs, they have good salaries, they're a developed country. There really isn't a motivation for them to want to compromise or to make changes to the occupation. Whereas, of course, the status quo is very harmful for Palestinians. So how can we have an impact in this situation, right? Like, and people say, write to your congressman, do this, do that. But there's a more fundamental thing, right? I mean, the UC, I'm a student at Stanford. Stanford has a huge endowment. Much of this endowment goes into corporations that are actively helping facilitate Israel's human rights abuses, right? If we can get the universities to divest from these companies, or even more fundamentally, if we can get resolutions from the student government saying that we don't want to be invested in this company, it raises the cost slightly more, right? The company now, when it's thinking about whether or not to give Israel a contract to build, for example, Veolia Transport, which is building an Israeli-only tram line to connect settlements to Israel proper, or Caterpillar bulldozers, which custom makes bulldozers that are used to destroy homes. When they have to think twice, when they have to consider that there could be economic ramifications to pursuing these policies, maybe then they won't decide to do that, right? So, for example, look outside divestment, look at boycott. There are increasingly numbers of bands that are refusing to perform in Israel until after these policies change, right? So every time you increase the cost slightly and you make it more difficult for the Israeli government and Israeli taxpayers to want to maintain the current status quo system, the more likely it is to change. And it's basically saying we have direct control over where our mosques, our churches, our universities invest money. Let's take that direct control. Let's make it that much difficult, for these companies to, or for the Israeli government to continue with its unjust policies.
You said that BDS is more important than dialogue. What did you mean? What kind of dialogue do you think is not necessary? What kind would you recommend?
Sure. I mean, when I say dialogue, I mean very particularly. I think educational events is very important. It's important to raise awareness. What I'm specifically talking to is initiatives like the Olive Tree Initiative, right? And the issue with that, right, is a lot of times people think the problem is that, on college campuses, that different groups can have a civil dialogue, right? Like that the problem is, we feel unsafe or we feel uncomfortable on campus, right? What I mean when I say dialogue isn't productive is if we spend our time, sitting down at a table, trying to, between students, figure out what the best solution is, it might be a nice exercise for us. But even if, the Palestinian Student Awareness, SJP and the Stanford, the Israel Alliance group on campus sit down and they draft a charter for agreed to principles, that's not going to change the reality on the ground, right? Look at South Africa, since that's the theme of today's talk. The reconciliation process happened after the apartheid regime fell, right? There was no point in blacks and whites in South Africa in 1990 sitting down and talking about possible reconciliation process, because they fundamentally lived in a situation that perpetuated that injustice. So you have to change that underlying reality. And when it becomes a time where you live together, Israelis and Palestinians don't live together now, and you want to build a society that you can have coexistence, understanding, then you do that. But any effort that's distracting from a focus on ending the everyday human rights violations is a diversion, and that's and that I think is taking away valuable resources that can go towards boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaigns, which are the sorts of forces that historically have changed conflicts. So I think that's what I'm talking about. I think having educational events is very valuable, but I think you need to cater those events towards a specific goal. And I think dialogue for the sake of talking, it might feel good, but at the end of the day, it's not going to actually help the people on the ground who suffer from everyday injustice and occupation.
Thank you all for coming out. We hope that you found this event informative and beneficial. Please join us tomorrow for a Holocaust survivalist appeal with peace activist Hedy Epstein, and at 8 p.m. contextualizing the politics of Palestine with UC Berkeley Senior Lecturer Dr. Hakim Bazian in this room. Thank you for coming out and have a good night.